Happy day to all. I am Vinodhini, Assistant Professor from the Department of Management Studies MBA program, presenting this module on Incoterms and International Commercial Instruments, which is a topic in international business. While there are numerous ways to conduct international trade, export is considered as a core approach where goods and services manufactured in one country are sold to buyers in another country. In the last financial year, that is 24-25, India had exported 824 billion worth of goods to countries all over the world, according to a report released by the Reserve Bank of India. Of that, the top exported items include textile, leather, mineral fuels, gems and precious metals, pharmaceutical items, automobile components, and iron and steel. In fact, last week I happened to participate in an Indo-US Trade and Investment Connect, where the need to create the right ecosystem for the exporters in terms of setting up the special economic zone and the export promotion zone, which facilitates a single window clearance, were discussed, and the need and importance to have a buyer-sellers meet was also discussed in elaborate. Having said that, there are certain risks involved in exports which needs to be analyzed and understood well, and few of the risks are mentioned here, such as financial risk, legal risk, political challenges and uncertainties, which needs to be understood by both the buyers and sellers alike for them to have a smooth international transaction in order to mitigate the potential risk and losses. In this context, I would like to discuss about Incoterms or the international commercial terms and the various commercial payment instruments which clarifies the responsibilities of the buyers and sellers during the transactions. So, what is Incoterm? The Incoterm is a set of standardized rules that define the responsibilities of the buyers and sellers in the international and in the domestic business transaction. So, it was developed and published by the International Chamber of Commerce, and it facilitates international trade, as I had mentioned earlier. It is updated every 10 years to keep abreast of the developments in the international transaction, and the one that we follow now is the Incoterm put forth in 2020, which is the 9th version of Incoterm. And put together, there are about 11 common Incoterms that the buyer and sellers need to understand before getting into a contract. So, over the years, Incoterms have provided guidance not only for the importers and exporters, but also for the lawyers in case of settling disputes, transporters when they move the goods from one place to another, insurers and others involved in the international trade. And the core functions of Incoterms used are mentioned here. It outlines the obligation of the buyer and the seller in a trade transaction. It clarifies when the risk passes from the seller to the buyer, and it also outlines how the costs are allocated between the buyer and the seller. So, there are about 11 Incoterms that are explained here in this presentation, of which 4 are specific to sea and inland waterways. The first being Ex works, where the seller makes the goods available at the premises, and all the risk and the cost that is involved in transporting the goods from the seller's destination to the buyer's point is borne by the buyer. So, the other costs are mentioned here as the transportation cost, the export and import duties, the insurance are everything that is borne by the buyer. The next one is called as free carrier or FCA, where the seller delivers the goods to a named carrier or place nominated by the buyer and handles the export formalities, and from there on the risk transfers to the buyer. So, it is one step more than Ex works, where instead of just placing the goods at the destination, the export formalities are also handled by the seller in the case of FCA. So, what is carriage paid to? CPT, or in other words CPT, where the seller pays for carriage of goods to a named destination, but the risk transfers when the goods are handed over to the carrier. The next one is referred to as carriage and insurance paid to, which is similar to carriage paid to the previous one, but here since you see the insurance is also added to the Incoterm, the cost of insurance is borne by the seller in this case. The fifth Incoterm is referred to as DAP or delivered at place, where the seller covers the transport to a named place of destination, but does not take care of the unloading part of it or the import formalities. So, the risk transfers when the goods are ready for unload, and from there on it becomes the buyer's risk. Under DPU or delivered at place unloaded, apart from DAP, the seller also handle the job of unloading it. So, seller is responsible for delivery and physical unloading, at a named place and the buyer clears or does the import formalities. So, under DDP or delivered duty paid, which is little more extensive than DPU, the seller bears all the costs and risk associated with transport, including the export duties and clearance. This particular Incoterm is little more comprehensive compared to DPU. So, these are some of the Incoterms which are common to all modes of transport, and the one that is listed here is something, as I have mentioned here, is specific to sea and inland waterways. So, FAS or free alongside ship is a term where the seller delivers the goods alongside the ship, and after that at a named port of shipment as mentioned here, and after that the responsibility becomes that of the buyer. So, the seller does not load the goods on the board, whereas he just places it alongside the ship as mentioned in the free alongside ship Incoterm. Whereas in FOB, free on board, which is again a commonly used Incoterm in most of the transaction, the seller delivers the goods on board the ship at a named port or shipment, and the buyer is responsible for all the cost from there onwards. So, which means it is one step more than free alongside ship, where the goods are boarded onto the ship, and from there onwards whatever cost that is incurred, which includes the insurance and the transportation, is borne by the buyer. As far as cost and freight or CFR is concerned, the seller pays for freight of goods to a named port of destination, and the risk transmits upon loading onto the vessel. And the last one is referred to as the CIF, where cost, insurance and freight is something that is similar to CFR, but the seller pays for the insurance also on top of freight. So, here the insurance is also covered along with the freight charges. So, these are the 11 Incoterms which is being agreed between the buyer and seller even before they get into a transaction, for better understanding of their responsibilities and the cost sharing and the risk sharing also. So, this is a sample purchase order for you to understand how Incoterm is mentioned in a purchase order, and if you see the PO number, the date, delivery time, all is mentioned here. The shipping and delivery terms and the Incoterm in specific is also mentioned here. So, where we see it is mentioned here as free on board Shanghai port, which means the supplier XYZ component will place the goods on board at a designated ship in Shanghai port for it to be moved to the buyer's destination, that is Chicago. So, until he transfers the goods at the Shanghai airport at a certain named carrier, the risk is on the seller, and from there on the risk moves to the buyer. So, that is how you read the FOB Shanghai port in the Incoterm that is mentioned in this particular purchase order. I hope you understood the different obligations and risk involved in the 11 Incoterms that we had seen through. Now, we will move on to understand the different commercial payments or payment instruments that is available for international transactions. So, depending on the risk appetite, the value of goods sold, the trust placed between the parties, the import and export regulations and the competitors offering, the choice of instrument can be chosen by the buyer and seller mutually. So, let us understand what letter of credit is, which is one of the most commonly used instrument of payment in commercial international transactions. So, letter of credit is a document or issued by a bank on behalf of the buyer, whom is referred to as the applicant, and it guarantees payment to the seller or the beneficiary upon presentation of specific documents fulfilling the terms of LC, and LCs are provided by the bank against collaterals, and they are also a popular choice because of the fact that they are more secured and risk is limited in this case. Now, this is a pictorial representation as to how LC works. If you see here, this is the issuing bank which acts on behalf of the buyer, and there is a confirming bank that acts on behalf of the seller. So, the transaction happens between the issuing bank and the confirming bank on behalf of the buyer and seller respectively, where the issuing bank agrees to give a LC for the buyer against certain collaterals, and the issuing bank will release the letter of credit to the confirming bank upon production of the appropriate documents that is required for clearance, which may include the quantity of goods sold, the cost of goods sold, the time it was sold, the date on which the material was delivered. So, all the documents that is required for them to release the LC will be has to be produced by the confirming bank for the issuing bank to release the LC. So, since it acts against collateral, this transaction or the mode of payment is considered as the most secured and most used one as well in the international business. Now, other payment instruments in international transaction include cash in advance. As the name mentions, the cash or the payment is taken in advance even before the goods are delivered to the buyer. So, it is considered as a very safe bet for the seller, but not for the buyer, as he has to make the payment even before the goods are received. The next one is open account, where the seller ships goods and invoices to the buyer, who pays at a later date. So, which means the goods are delivered first and then the payment is taken later. So, this might happen when there is high level of trust between the seller and the buyer, where he agrees to deliver the goods and then collect the payment. So, this becomes less secure method for the seller and more secure for the buyer, in contrast with the case of cash in advance. Another popular instrument that is used in international transaction is what is referred to as bill of exchange, which is a legally binding written agreement between the two parties, the buyer and the seller, and one party commits to pay a specific amount to another on demand at a future date. Another popular instrument used in international transaction is mentioned as promissory note, which is also a written unconditional promise by one party to another party at a specific, to pay a specific amount of money at a future date. But unlike a bill of exchange, promissory note is not a legally binding document. It is just a promise that is given by the buyer to the seller, and who promises to pay a certain amount at a future date of time. So, again here there must be a huge level of trust placed between two parties to execute this. Apart from these, checks and wire transfers are also considered as other modes of payment. So, those were the Incoterms which clarified the responsibilities between the buyer and seller in terms of the risk involved, in terms of the cost and the obligations during the transportation of goods, and the various commercial payment instruments available for the buyer and seller to choose whichever is appropriate for them, depending on the trust and the risk involved in the transaction. I hope this video was useful and informative for you. For more such informative videos, please like, share and subscribe to M.O.P Classroom.